Yeah, I don't see an agenda, so I'm not sure we're going to have anybody showing up for today's meeting anyway. Do you have anything you want to chat about, Sajay? I know we've been going back and forth on the reference type stuff.
Yeah, it'd be good to get input from the others, right? Like, just want to get everybody's eyes on it and then kind of make some decision. I think that's what I'm hoping.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Nothing for me.
Be good to get at least a feedback from Michael or John on what they think, right? So it'll be make it easier for the proposal to kind of go through. That's what I was hoping in the end. Do you see the PR that Vincent posted about moving descriptor and all that to distribution? There was an RSC, right?
He had an issue opened over on image spec. Hi, Josh. I think you're talking about this one.
Yeah. It's an interesting take. I don't know.
Descriptor's always been that complicated one.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like that third rail that, somebody wants to touch it, okay. Josh can't hear. Oh, no. But other than that, moving the image layout over, that one seems fine to me. I'd throw in there the comment saying I would rename it, call it the file system layout because it's not just images.
Yeah, but why would we move that to distribution spec though?
If not distribution spec, it would have to kind of be its own spec.
Right. Isn't that what image spec is?
I think the idea is image spec, people are pushing to say this is just the definition for the media type for an image manifest and an index.
I see.
There's a push to kind of really constrain what's in that one spec.
Okay.
And since distribution came later, it didn't have things in image spec needed to even do its own job. And so now that you have distribution spec, I think there's a push to say, hey, we got this new space we can put stuff over on. Let's move it over. Get out of here.
I see. The layout has got nothing to do with distribution because there's no API that governs how it should be, right?
It's basically it's the sneaker net distribution. So we defined here is what distribution is if you've got a registry. So maybe it's just saying, okay, and if you don't, you want to sneaker net it across, this is how you deal with the file system.
I see.
In my own code, I treat an image layout, file system layout, as basically a local registry, local repository. So you start dumping a bunch of stuff in this one directory and just treat like a repository.
But then don't you have to specify how it can be used? Like there's this hidden thing that an OCI layout is all under one repository, right? Multi-repository layouts are not supported. Like you Docker does this magic tagging thing for repository names and all that. So distribution does handle repository scope, but what we're saying is if a repository needs to be file laid out, then we can use the OCI layout, but the access pattern is still, I don't know. It's a mix, in my opinion.
It's files in a directory. The reason I say that it's like a repository is because everything in there, the only annotation they include is a tag. They don't include a tag for any other structure in there.
Yeah, we had the same problem. So that's why I was thinking, like, if we were to put this in, we need to probably have a conformance test as to what can it test, right? Like, you have a layout, how do you access it? What's the expectation of the layout also? From a distribution standpoint, I understand from an image layout standpoint, it's pretty straightforward. From a file system per se, like what does it mean for distribution to actually have a file system layout? Or do we even need conformance tests for this if we bring the spec over?
I don't know if you need it or not. Clients might need it. but a server would need it from their side of saying, hey, I'm a registry server. There's nothing for them to do for that spec. But we don't have any conformance for clients right now. All the conformance is for registry servers.
Correct.
I've considered what that would look like, but I don't have any good answers for that right now.
Yeah, leave it to Josh. Josh is the person who's most passionate about the conformance, right? So maybe he can.
Josh, is your audio working yet?
It is. I think I need to catch up on what we're talking about, but I can help write tests for sure.
We were chatting about, I think you bounced in and out, so I'll just repost the same link here in the chat. 907 on the image spec. It's an issue over there.
Yeah, I saw that.
We're chatting about what does it mean when you move image layout over? Do there need to be conformance tests for a file system layout, or are conformance tests only on what a registry server does?
I don't know. I feel like if it's in the tests that are in distribution spec, I'm not sure.
I mean, from that right now, it's just a description, isn't it? Yeah, there's no code at all. So theoretically, you could say, create this layout and then have a test to see if it matches what we expect. But again, we're testing client. Well, I guess we always, I'm back and forth with myself deciding whether or not we're talking client or server at this point.
Yeah, that's why I was confused as to what does it mean to put it in distribution. Like, I think what I'm hearing, or maybe correct me if I'm wrong, this is a way to distribute images in a directory structure. That might be the way to think about it, is what I'm understanding.
It's a way to sneakernet to transmit anything via the file system instead of on a registry API that you would normally store in a registry. And so I don't want to scope it to just images, because this spans more than images. If we start defining artifacts and other stuff like that.
Right. So it would be an entire repository, right? In some way, a minimum of a repository, cross repositories.
Anything you would normally push to a repository, you could push to one of these directories. And in a way right now, Scopio, myself on Reg Client, we already do that today.
And the example layout is under one directory. So there's no definition of a concept of a repository in this at all. That's what
So the index.json that's in there is basically your tag listing.
Right. And that's why there's no cross repository definition of this layout.
Yeah, I mean, you need there's no cross repository in anything in OCI. Everything in OCI is always scoped to an individual repository.
No, the mount API in distribution is actually cross repository.
Okay, I'll give you that one. But otherwise, authentication, all that stuff is always mostly scoped to, you've got access to just this one repository. And so, yeah, if you wanted to have multiple of these things, it would end up being two different directories. And if
the other challenge is that the concept of reference, the first part has to be either the FTD and or the repository. So references by themselves don't work here. It doesn't translate directly to a reference, right? You have a notion of a tag only. So a fully qualified reference or a partially qualified reference does not actually map to this. So you need to know how to construct the reference in some way also. So the problem is, what I'm trying to say is that there's a little bit of a handshake of what the image layout represents and what a client can expect. By virtue of being in a directory, it doesn't mean that the directory is the name of the repository or how it's actually referenced. So that's the other connotation. Sorry about that. Dogs are going crazy.
No problem. I'm pulling up an example right now. So I can show you not only all my failing test cases, but also in the case where we've been doing references before, you can do the tag schema in there. And so if I did a tag ls on this directory locally on my machine, it's got an index that contains these things, and I could just have an entry in there for the ref name with here's that big digest. And that's my tag. And so using the backward compatible syntax we've got, it works. How you would do the other reference, there's no API on this. So how you would do the other references within here, maybe we can find a good way to do that with the other, as you add other manifest in here. But then clients that are copying stuff across, they can just say, hey, do I see this big long digest in there when I'm starting to copy this thing? Okay, I know. Here's my tag. Here's the reference to that tag. Is that kind of what you're thinking, Sajay?
Yes, sorry, I had to run. There was somebody who came. Yeah, so I think what you're doing is kind of like linking through the index JSON, right? The references at this point, what you just showed.
It's what I was doing there was basically proposal E with the backward compatible tag syntax. And so if you're using the backward compatible tag syntax, you just push it in here. Possibly we could also go out there and say, hey, if you're pushing up a reference, there needs to be some other object in this index in addition to all these manifest things. And maybe that can be another array entry in here. In addition to manifest, you might have references.
Makes sense. I think I see where you're going with this. Actually, I was talking about the fact that the definition of a reference is it has a repository name followed by a tag, right? So in the OCI,
that goes to another issue. I think you're talking about something else. You're talking about the actual syntax of docker.io/library/whatever, aren't you?
Right. But with the image layout spec, you cannot use a reference to access anything in the index. You have to kind of strip off the repository part now and only use the tag to look at the index, versus all references should be able to qualify to something, right? And that becomes a little more tricky here.
Yeah, basically, how do you make a command that does that?
Correct.
I started throwing a schema in front of it. And
so
then
if you were to look at, if I were to say access this image from this index, how do you qualify that image?
Like that.
So you assume that the first part is a directory, right?
Everything up to the colon is the directory. Everything after
Right.
the OCI dir, I know that I'm talking to a file system instead of a registry image.
So I think just clarifying that in the image layout, or whatever you want to call it, would be good, that the reference actually translates to a directory plus the tag, not just because the index doesn't have a notion of a repository. Versus in distribution, you always have a reference that you can kind of work with in some way. That was the other thing that I was kind of alluding to, because you have to the repository object does exist against which you can do the query, right?
You were going back to my comment last week of we need to define what a reference is.
Right. And
because that isn't at all in any of the stuff that OCI does. We never say what a reference is anywhere. The only place I know that talks about that is distribution.
Correct. And the regex and the the conformance actually has that. So now you get into, can the reference be, all the casing and all that also becomes a challenge here. So how do tools actually construct this would be the question.
Does conformance care about references? Really? Internally it might, but externally we're talking to a registry server. You don't see that reference once you start talking to the registry APIs. You're seeing, hey, I'm calling this repository under this path for this tag.
I think there is a specification of how the repository names can or cannot be, right? There are characters that are not allowed and whatnot. So I think the mixing of, for example, casing in there is a problem.
There's how you can name a repository, but it's not saying how you can take a reference and expand that into the
Yeah,
repository.
I don't think the conformance test actually defines that.
Yeah, because that's a layer that the API doesn't really care about. They're like, as long as you hit this HTTP path, you've already parsed that reference at that point.
Yes, so distribute, that's the other thing, right? So now we're crossing from HTTP to something else here when you use file access. That's what I was trying to say. Like, if we qualify that distribution is non-HTTP and can be file-based, then it makes sense. Plus, if you're saying that references are not defined and can be anything that can be derived up to the colon for OCI, like image layout, it also makes sense. Versus for registries, there's an implicit assumption that the first part is the reference followed by the tag, right? And they split that HTTP path in a specific way.
To be clear, this is Brandon's syntax. This is not OCI syntax.
No, I totally get it. But it's probably good to just call out, because I know that singularity images and all that, they use a very similar Docker colon, OCI colon, and things like that as well. So
yes, Scopio started getting a little bit into that as well. They've got their own syntax over there, very similar with the Docker colon and some other stuff. Yeah, my selection on OCI dir was knowing that I would have also OCI tar files, TGZs, because you can compress these into a tar and then package them later on. So I figured I would leave a door open for when that happens later on. But yeah, it is very much just me picking it out and saying, I got to do something at some point here, because people want to start copying these images from a registry to a local file system and then back out again somewhere else. So yeah, I can.
Yeah, so it was actually interesting because I can probably share something we did internally for transferring images across air gap, where we create a catalog JSON, but that's cross repository that has another image or another file that's like index, but it has repo information as well, so that you can actually transfer multiple repositories. The image layout is now limited to that one repository scope, and that's why it makes it simple. But the moment you want to kind of like move a Helm chart over with the images, it kind of falls apart. So you need to do multiple tars, and you've got to keep all of them kind of like going forward. So it would be, anyway, that's more like if we propose and if we discuss it, that would be interesting.
The other option is that you potentially throw in a different annotation in there, that you start adding a second annotation for the repository in addition to the annotation for the tag.
Right. Yeah, I know. And that's why I'm being really cautious of who would feel what it could kind of like explode in scope. And
I think I've seen putting the repository in there at some point.
yeah, and I believe that the runtime layout has a repositories file that holds this information in some way, but not in how we store it or in the image spec layout itself. So there are multiple ways to do this, but anyway, I think I need to drop off. I have another call at 10:30, unfortunately.
All right. Looks like Josh dropped too. So Tiana, unless you have something, or Brandon or Ramkar, I'm probably going to drop myself.
No, you guys know I always like being a fly on the wall when I can. So
No worries.
But Brandon, what about my directories that have colons in their names?
Now you're getting to the problem.
I only care about the last colon. Yep.
It only matters if the last directory has a colon in it and the thing after the colon is still a valid tag.
It does.
Then it's a problem.
Then you can't use latest. Then you must be specific.
Yep. I've done similar things. I'm just trolling you.
No. I was looking at it, I was like, I'm just going to tell the users, sorry, too bad, too sad. You got to put a label in there. You can't rely on latest to be the default.
Yeah, and this is why the reference and the repository name kind of conversation, once we define what it should be, then people don't extract it to some random place with date formats with colon in there and time in there, and then they expect to mount that and everything breaks, right? So
I mean, I also support the @SHA notation for a pinned entry, so that's another one.
yeah. Wow, yeah.
You think I'm kidding, but I'm not.
Yeah, I don't want to go there.
All right. Until next week. Good chat with you guys.
Take care, guys. Have a great weekend.